It's a report nearly 2 years in the making. By all outward appearances, the Mueller investigation may be winding down. Several of his top attorneys are leaving. The top FBI agent assigned to the case departed this week, and rumors are swirling that Attorney General William Barr will declare the official end of the probe any day now. Adding to the irresponsible speculation, Donald Trump weighed in on the Mueller report last night after his usual refrain of no collusion, witch hunt.
We'll see what the report says. Let's see if it's fair. I have no idea when it's going to be released. Let it come out. Let people see it. That's up to the Attorney General.
Of course, it's worth taking Trump's declaration with a grain of salt, or maybe a spoonful, since he tweeted just last week that the special counsel, quote, should never have been appointed and there should be no Mueller report. But he was, and there will be. And while Attorney General Barr does have a lot of freedom to decide what to release to the public, the Mueller investigation is just one of many looking into Trump. This week, Mueller's team released a trove of documents from early on in the investigation, focusing on Trump's former fixer, Michael Cohen, whose case was later passed along to the Southern District of New York. We also learned last night, according to CNN, Trump's former communications director, Hope Hicks, is now cooperating in another investigation of the president, this one run by the House Judiciary Committee. So let's try to skip to the last chapter of the Mueller book with a guy who has his own new book. Joining me is former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, who was abruptly fired by the president, Preet Bharara. Good to see you, Preet.
Thanks for having me.
His new book, by the way, part true crime, part explainer, part embrace of the best of our legal system, is called Doing Justice. Good to see you. So I got the book. I cannot tell a lie. I go right to the index, Donald Trump, and there are almost no listings.
Very
what was
few.
that about?
You know, I think we talk a lot about Donald Trump, and I think it's appropriate to do on news programs like this. I talk about him on my podcast, on Twitter. I say a lot of things. I mean, every once in a while, you got to take a step back and think about what we've lost in this country, and think about how we've departed from truth and evidence and fact-based decision-making, and you know what principles are. And I think if you do that and you talk about what the justice system should be like I try to do in the book, and remind people what polite disagreement, respectful debate that we have in courtrooms all around the country, maybe that provides something of a model for how we can talk about going back to where we should have been.
I remember some of those things.
Yeah.
Speaking of when I was young, one of the people who helped shape my view of the law, I was sort of a lawyer when I was a young kid,
Sort of.
was Atticus Finch, a fictional character. In your book, one of the people who helped, I think, shape your view of part of the law were the Menendez brothers, of all people. How did that come about?
Well, also other figures.
No, I understand that. I understand
including
that.
Clarence Darrow and people who
Yeah.
are, you know, upstanding like that. When I was in high school, I mean, in college, a friend of mine called me one day and said, you know, my parents' best friends were murdered. Not just murdered, you know, their heads almost blown off their bodies by shotguns in a violent attack. And I had heard about this family for a long time. My friend Jessica was devastated by it. They didn't know who did it. They thought it was a mob hit. And it turns out that it was the sons who did it, with whom she was friends. And it turns out that was it was Lyle and Eric Menendez who murdered their parents. But the reason I tell the story in the book is because it had a big impact on me. Because months went by with Jessica and me and other people and the cops in California speculating about what could have happened, why this murder took place. Never conceivable that it could have been their children. And even when the kids were arrested, I remember Jessica called me. We spent the whole night talking about how that could be, how the cops could have gotten it wrong. And then we find out that they conceded that they had done the shooting and they had a defense that they had been abused. And you realize, as I say in the book, you know, you really can't ever know anything about anybody, ultimately. You can't truly know. And that's interesting in a certain line of work where you have to be open-minded, not just about the innocence of people, but about the guilt of people who don't look guilty.
You know, speaking about the guilt of people, at least to, well, now a layperson, I am one of the people who actually criticized you, and you addressed this in your book, to your credit, for not prosecuting some of the masters of the universe from the financial institutions that helped bring down the economy in 2008. I don't want to debate, you talk about, you know, it's easy to say, but you have to be able to establish intent, and there's plausible deniability issues. They insulate themselves in many ways. But the takeaway from me is, unless I want to keep reading the same stories about why responsible prosecutors like you can't go after these people, it seems to me we've got to change something. Laws, piercing these veils. What do we do to ensure the next time there's a 2008, we don't find a prosecutor unable to get at the men and women who caused it?
Yeah, it's a profound question. I mean, I think ultimately, if you want to have a system in which we don't send people to prison for mere negligence or recklessness, which a lot of this was, or mere greed. You have to show that they had the intent to commit a crime, and they don't have the crutch of relying on a third-party opinion, either from an accountant or from a lawyer. Then it's difficult. Otherwise, if you change the law and made it much, much easier to arrest people without proving that they have intent, which would have been the easiest way to hold some of these folks accountable, that can be a little bit dangerous, because that could sweep into the ambit of the new law on the lower standard. People who unknowingly and unwittingly presided over small business, perhaps, where bad things were going on under their noses and they didn't know. And it's supposed to be hard to prove crimes against people. In some ways, more importantly, we should have tighter ethics programs at a lot of these institutions. I have a whole chapter about culture. At the end of the day, it would have been satisfying, I think, to a lot of people for more people to have gone to prison in connection with anything bad that goes on. But prosecution doesn't solve any widespread social, economic, or public safety problem, whether it's opioids or corruption in government or anything else. That's one part of it, and that should be done to the extent possible, but it takes a lot of other things too.
We move on to little Nostradamus time, if we can, if you don't mind. You've said you think that Mueller will take the comprehensive route in terms of the quality, the breadth of his report.
I do.
But that's not the key question for me, even though it's an important one. The key question is, once the Attorney General gets that comprehensive report, what does he do with it? What do you think William Barr does do with it?
It depends on what it says. I mean, I feel like there's three possibilities, right? One is that the report is devastating to the president, in which case there will be a big fight about not releasing it, not making it public, although I think it becomes more difficult if it becomes known that it's devastating to the president. There'll be a lot of pressure to release it. On the other hand, it might be not particularly harmful to the president. It might say there was some bad conduct here and there, but there was no quote-unquote collusion, and the obstruction couldn't be made out, in which case Bill Barr will be running to Congress to release it, and the president will be waving it around, saying it exonerates him. And then maybe the more likely scenario is it's a mixed bag. And the president has taken documents that don't say anything particularly exonerating of him, that are mixed bags, and say they are great for him.
But you seem to be saying in all three of those possible scenarios, Preet, that politics is what's going to determine what Barr does, not the statute that created
I
the
think
special
eventually,
counsel.
I mean, you may end up having a legal skirmish if they decide they don't want it to become public, don't want to give it to Congress, and they assert executive privilege or some other basis for keeping away from transparency, and then you'll have Congress, and they'll fight it in court, and that could go on for a long time. Public sentiment is going to play a big role. If 90% of the public wants to see what's in the report, it becomes very difficult for Congress not to do something about it and for it not to come out.
So what do they do? We talked about, Marjorie Egan and I had spent time with you on the radio today, and we talked about one of the critical questions, assuming that Barr does decide to play politics with this. What power does Congress have vis-a-vis not just the document itself, if it's redacted to death by executive privilege and what other things Barr thinks the public is not entitled to see, and Bob Mueller, who you praise as the most stand-up of stand-up guys, says the public didn't get the story. If they ask me to come before Congress, I'm coming. What happens?
Yeah, as we discussed, it's probably the best way to go about it, to get the earliest possible bird's eye view into what the Mueller report says, because Bob Mueller is not a document that is in the possession of some other person, and he doesn't have the authority to release the document, but he does sort of have the authority to speak. I imagine if they tried to do that, there would be a skirmish, again, an illegal skirmish, over what Bob Mueller is allowed to say or not say, and you could imagine the administration then running to court in some fashion to say, we don't want Bob Mueller to be speaking about this, that, or the other. That's just a little bit harder to contain when you're talking about someone like Mueller, who is a person with free will. I mean, he will have to abide by certain conditions and certain ethical obligations, but he can come and talk.
Is he the kind of person who you think is going to say, if the story isn't getting out, I do want to tell it to the American people through Congress?
Not really. There's a famous incident from 2004 that some people may remember, where Jim Comey rushed to the hospital, the bedside of the former Attorney General John Ashcroft, because people from the White House were trying to overrule Jim Comey and John Ashcroft. And on the way to the hospital to reapprove a terrorist surveillance program, and there was a constitutional crisis brewing, Jim Comey called Bob Mueller and had them both race to the hospital, and it was a very dramatic scene. And in the hearing actually that I helped arrange back in 2007, Jim Comey told that story in great detail, and it was a profound moment in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Bob Mueller has never told that story. So there's a little bit of a difference. I don't know that Bob Mueller is burning to tell stories and tell secrets, even if he thinks that they're useful. It has to happen in a particular way for him.
Do you worry? I mean, let's assume Barr decides politics should take a back seat, principle should take a front seat. or Mueller gets to testify in full. When you saw the Suffolk University right here poll with USA Today the other day, which shows the president's witch hunt line is working, 50% of the people seem to say we believe it's a witch hunt. Do you worry that even if there's an endless bill of particulars against the president, his kids, whatever the public says, and Republican senators say next?
Yeah, absolutely. In the same way that on the flip side, there are from time to time, whether they're talking about Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or anyone else, where there's nothing that rises to the level of criminal conduct, there are people who don't like that person enough that they think that it's, a deadly indictment. Mm-hmm. I think when you get to that level of people's feelings about a politician, they're prepared to put things aside.
So a couple of reaction things. When you heard on the station you spend a lot of time, and I spend a lot of time watching you at night, Andrew McCabe was interviewed by Anderson Cooper, and the last question, I literally almost fell off my chair. Cooper asked him something like, do you still believe that the President of the United States could be a Russian asset? And McCabe, acting head of the FBI, says yes. What was your reaction? This is the President of the United States. And again, a guy who ran the chief law enforcement thing in the United States saying our president might still be a Russian. What was your reaction to that?
Stunned, like I have been over so many things that have happened in the last couple of years. And stunned also, by the way, that doesn't cause tens of millions of more people to have their heads explode and say, what's going on here? So many things have been normalized. So many bits of conduct, so many breaches of ethics, that it's kind of amazing, both that someone would think that, and also that the reaction is somewhat muted.
Do you find it plausible, based on what you know?
Andy McCabe knows a lot more than I know. I'm a private citizen now and have not recently been in the government. There's a lot of conduct that indicates something is going on. When you take the word of Vladimir Putin over the word of your own intelligence agencies, there's something funny going on.
Also, based upon what you know as a private citizen, pre-Mueller report, it seems to me that there is a lot of evidence that this president has committed crimes, that he has obstructed justice. His own words to Lester Holt, the part of the testimony from Michael Cohen that I find credible, but I don't know what Congress or a jury would think. Do you think the case has been made against him, a criminal case?
So to separate two things. There's evidence of those things. The fact that there's evidence of those things doesn't necessarily take you over the threshold for either probable cause or proof beyond a reasonable doubt. You said you were sort of a lawyer once.
Sort of.
So I think absolutely there's evidence. Whether it's enough, depending on what the other facts are, I don't know. But the one thing that we do know is that my old office in Southern District seems to endorse the view that Michael Cohen uttered in his guilty plea that he committed a campaign finance violation for which he's going to prison in coordination with and at the direction of individual
number one, right?
The President of the United States.
Do you, by the way, you do believe the Southern District in New York, your old office, is a far greater threat to this president because of the breadth of their...
Because of the breadth, and also they're not on a clock. They're not on a wind down, right? No one's breathlessly reporting, well, when's the SDNY report coming out? Because they have no such time limit.
Getting back to the Atticus Finchian view of the world, you really do a really good job, I think, of celebrating the best of the rule of law and those sort of things. But, as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, as I think almost everybody will, there's a president of the United States who disparagingly referred to a judge as a Mexican. Not only was he wrong, but he was irrelevant. He said there are Obama judges and there are other kinds of, meaning the Obama judges obviously don't care about the rule of law. He disparaged relentlessly the Attorney General of the United States. He is celebrated, or at least said they're fine people among white supremacists. How can anybody believe that this trickles through to all of us when the person who leads this country believes in absolutely none of it?
Yeah, I mean, you left some out. He disparages a person who's been dead, a war hero, who's been dead for a number of months, John McCain. I mean, the list goes on and on. You know why? Because Donald Trump is going to go at some point, either involuntarily, which I tend to doubt, although some people hope for it, or by election, either in 2 years or in 6 years. What is left behind will be a lot of people who want to make sure that we go back on the right path. And I think that people need to stop focusing so much on all the crazy, provocative, insulting, demeaning, disgusting things that Donald Trump says every day. Leave that for Twitter. But in a serious way, try to think about how we re-educate everyone and think about that which this country was founded on. Certain values of decency and respect for rule of law and respect for law enforcement and passionate but dignified and respectful debate back and forth, and a return to thinking about truth and believing that lies are a bad thing. and conduct ourselves in ways that we would be proud of, as opposed to the way we've all devolved, not just Donald Trump. Maggie Haberman, I've had on my podcast a couple of times, the New York Times reporter. She says, you know what? Other people who used to behave in a particular way and at a certain level of decorum find themselves lowering themselves in the debate with Donald Trump, and it's almost too much. And so one of the points I make in the book over and over and over again is, let's think about, forget about Trump. Let's think about what we think is the right and good way to do things. And then at such time when there are more people prepared to do that, I think we'll have a blueprint.
Great podcast. Forgot to mention Stay Tuned, as it's called. Good to see you.
Thank you,
Thanks.
sir.
Great book, too.
Thanks.
Part of the re-education. He's talking about the book again is Doing Justice, Prosecutors' Thoughts on Crime, Punishment, and the Rule of Law.